Corinthians chapter 12 this morning. This last month and a half, I don't know what it is, but for whatever reason, in the mornings I want to say evening, and the evenings I want to say morning. I don't know why it is, but that's what's been happening lately. Maybe it's because my nights and days are a little bit messed up with a child that has nights and days messed up. Back to the Word of God. We're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 this morning, and I want to be very honest with you, something that is very sad, I think. I don't think I know, and it's not something that I have experienced to a great deal. I thank the Lord for it. I'm thankful for it, and the Lord has blessed me in that I have not had to deal with this much, but something that happens all too often is, I think, one of the individuals that is sometimes treated the worst within a church can be the pastor. I think there are times where it's intentional. I think other times it's not intentional. It's just because of our sin nature that it happens. But it does happen at times where God's men, God's leaders, are treated very poorly. And there's not, and like I said, it's not something that I have experienced anywhere near like I know other men have, and I thank the Lord for it. But it happens. Sometimes what happens too is people have really what could be described as kind of like a short-term memory with their pastors, with the men that God has placed over them to lead. They have a bit of a short-term memory with it. And what I mean by that is pastors that have or leaders that have a long amount of time that they've spent investing and serving and proving their love and proving their desire to serve in God's church and to serve God's people and to work. They've spent all this time proving who they are, and then something happens, and people forget all of that and treat them or ignore them or respond to them in a way that you would respond to somebody that doesn't care about those things. It may be in a way that's similar to that of what a false teacher would be treated, or somebody that doesn't care. And it's because sometimes short-term memory. We forget all the other things in the past, and we respond to them in a way that is not deserved, is not appropriate. When we look into our text, Paul is talking about the way that the Corinthians are responding to him as a man of God. And he, up until this point, in the previous chapters, verses, Paul has been proving himself as an apostle, proving himself as a man of God. Because there was a false teacher, or maybe even false teachers in the Corinthian church that had been undermining Paul as a man of God, undermining Paul as an apostle of God. And so Paul was forced to remind them of all the things that he had done that proved that he was an apostle of God. Some of this false teacher, or even those false teachers, they even went as far as to say that Paul was in it for his own glory and was taking advantage of the Corinthian church. And the things they were saying about Paul was in no way, shape, or form true, and was causing the Corinthian church to reject Paul and to be upset with Paul. And it was all because of what these false teachers had come in and started saying about Paul, and the Corinthians had just forgotten everything. or ignored it. And they were not responding to Paul in the way that he deserves. And when Paul is talking about this, he's not talking about it in a very arrogant way. He's talking about it in very much so a very spiritual manner. And even makes the statement multiple times that he's upset with them, that he had to prove himself as an apostle because he'd rather not talk about himself. He'd rather just talk about the gospel. He'd rather just talk about the Lord. He hates having to talk about himself, but he's had to talk about himself. He's had to prove himself so that he can talk about the gospel, because these false teachers have taken them away from the gospel. And so he has to prove himself worthy to be listened to so that he can tell them to forsake these false teachers that have led them astray. Paul. The man that has done so much. Just look at the Corinthian church, and he has a very long history with them. But the other churches that Paul had been used by the Lord to start, other things that Paul has done, the things that we see about Paul. He wasn't perfect, but Paul was very zealous for the Lord and proved his zealousness for the Lord many times over. Proved his authority in the Lord many times over. And instead of being able to focus on the important things, because of the problems that the Corinthian church was having with him, he had to ignore the important things to deal with this problem that was existing. And so the work of God was held back because they weren't following Paul as they should have. They weren't giving Paul the respect and the willingness to follow like he had proved in having followed the Lord. So this morning I've titled our message, What a Leader Deserves. And I think a better title of it would be, What a Godly Leader Deserves. It really comes down to following him as he leads you in the Lord. Respecting and not to ignore sin, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying to treat them as if they are God or as if they are perfect, but with forgiveness and humility, be willing to remember what's being done, what's important, and to not be easily deceived by other people or other things that may happen that may hinder you from ultimately following the Lord, because it happens. And it doesn't just happen, I want you to understand, it doesn't just happen on an entire church rejecting a man's scale. It does happen that way. But I think far too often what actually happens is on a daily, case-by-case basis it happens a lot of times. Where something comes up, there's a time or there's an area where this becomes a problem. And it's something that we always have to watch. And really, it's something we need to watch in our relationship with all believers. Because we can have this happen with other believers too, that we forget the love that they've proved. We forget the things that they've done in the past to prove who they are, and we allow something very short term to have a very lasting impact on our relationship with them. Or to create a rift or a division that is completely unnecessary, completely unwarranted, and cause very great problems. It ultimately hinders the work of God. We begin here in chapter 12, we begin in verse 11. Look at what Paul says here. He says, I am become a fool in glory. You have compelled me, for I ought to have been commended of you. For in nothing am I behind the very chiefest apostles, though I be nothing. The first thing that Paul talks about here, and he's talking about the Corinthians' foolishness here. What they were doing, the way that they were acting was very foolish. It was not mature, it was not righteous, it was foolish. And he says the first thing he talks about here is their lack of commendation for Paul, of respect. I already mentioned it, but chapter 11, and even into chapter 12, Paul was, especially chapter 11, Paul was talking about all the things that have happened to him as an apostle of God. And he's talking about the things that proved his authority, and he's talking about the ways that he has suffered and the ways that he has sacrificed for other people, even for the Corinthians. That he's having to prove himself as an apostle. How Christ had worked in him, how how the Lord had desired to use him, and all of these things that had happened. And Paul talks about himself in this, and when he's talking about it, he references himself as in having to be forced to boast in himself. He says in 11 here, he says, I am become a fool in glorying, ye have compelled me. He says, you have forced me to act like a fool. And what he means by this is you've forced me to talk about myself in a way that only fools want to talk about themselves about. He says, you forced me to talk about myself, to boast about the things that I've done. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to focus on myself. I want to be focusing on Christ. But you forced me to go and do this because you have rejected me and have forgotten who I am. Paul saw this, and he's mentioned this many times. He saw this as being forced to act like a fool because they were acting like fools. Paul states, he says, I should have, he says, for I ought to have been commended of you. And what he means here is to be united together. That they should have banded with Paul when these false teachers came in, or his false teacher came in and started saying these things. They should have been Paul's defender. They should have been advocating, saying, no, Paul is a man of God. Paul is an apostle of Christ. You are wrong in what you're saying about him. That if they had been defending Paul, Paul wouldn't have had to boast in himself. Now, I want you to understand this. There are times where people, they say very hateful things about other believers, about God's men they are leading. And as believers, we should be the ones defending them. When we know it's not true, or we know that it's not who they actually are, they've just made a mistake, we should say as such. We should be in their corner and say, no, yeah, they're not perfect, but I've seen all of these other things that they've done. I've witnessed all these other things that they've done, and that's not who they are. That's not who they are. You know, it's sad how often we are so quick to throw other believers, especially other leaders, under the bus. And to jump on the bandwagon of gossip and rumors and rejection. And we need to be quick to unite with each other and to defend. Even when there is an honest mistake, be the one that defends and says that, yeah, they've made a mistake, but I know they're better than that. That's not who they are. Advocate. Don't gossip. Don't add to the problem. Add to the solution. And this is what Paul is saying to him. He's saying, I shouldn't have had to say these things to you guys. You guys, and he's going to talk about it. He's like, you guys have witnessed these things with me. You should have banded together with this false teacher and said, no, what you're saying is wrong. That's not who Paul is. Leave. Or sit down and be quiet. Because, and Paul makes this statement here. In the end of this verse, he says, in nothing am I behind the very chiefest apostles, though I be nothing. Now, Paul is using this term here, chiefest apostles, in kind of an ironic sense. He's talking about these false teachers that came in. That really what they were doing was they were claiming that they were the greatest of the greatest apostles. I like to consider that they thought that they were super apostles. And we kind of understand this because if you go back into chapter 11 when Paul is beginning this, and you look at verses 4 and 5, it says, for if he that cometh preacheth another Jesus whom we have not preached, or if ye receive another spirit which ye have not received, or another gospel which ye have not accepted, ye might well bear with him. For I suppose I was not a whit behind the very chiefest apostles. He's talking about the false teachers and the things that they're saying and the things that they were teaching. It's kind of similar to what he talks about in Galatians when he says, if anybody ever comes in and tells you something else, reject them because it's wrong. And he's saying if these other people, they came in and they started teaching you these other things and saying these other things and saying that they were greater, and they're not because they're teaching heresy. They're saying things that are wrong. Paul's saying you guys should have looked at them and saw the things that they were doing and said, what they're saying these other things that are wrong, so I know what they're saying about Paul is wrong. Paul's saying you should have understood why they were saying what they were saying. They were just trying to build themselves up. They weren't trying to help you. They're helping themselves. And Paul says, he says, I'm not behind these super apostles. And I'm not much of anything. Because you look in Timothy's, in his writing to Timothy, and he calls himself the chief of sinners. Paul's not being arrogant here. He's stating a fact. He's saying these guys are heretical. They're false teachers. They are not greater than me because they're false teachers. What they're saying was wrong, and you should have known it. And this is why Paul puts in at the end, he says, though I be nothing. I think he's referencing this in reflection of himself with the true apostles, and also more importantly with the Lord. He knows that he is nothing in comparison with the Lord. He's not being arrogant here. He's talking about the truth for their benefit. Paul isn't a prideful man in this area, but they've forced him to be prideful for a reason that never should have taken place. They have forced Paul to be somebody that is not the kind of man that Paul wants to be in following the Lord, that he shouldn't have to be in following the Lord because of their own shortcomings. I want you to understand this, that when we refuse to unite together in the truth, when we refuse to advocate whenever somebody is speaking wrong things, somewhere we force things to happen that are not beneficial for God's word, for God's gospel, for the work of the Lord. Now, and it may not be that the person is heretical in the things they're saying. They may just be mad. I think we can all think of a time when we are mad that we said things about somebody that we didn't really believe. It wasn't really true. Or known people that they were mad and so they were just making things up, or they were just trying to find ways to tear the other person down. And we need to look at the situation and understand what is this person's motivation here. Because it may be that their motivation is not spiritual. And that would possibly indicate that what they're saying is not spiritual. And in fact, sinful. And when it comes to a godly leader or another godly believer, when we hear that, the first thing we should be doing is thinking, wait, what's going on here? Because that doesn't match up with what I know. See, we should cling to unity before division. We should desire to be an advocate before a destroyer. And oftentimes I think the opposite is true of us. And we want to gossip or we want to destroy before we want to advocate. There are times when God's man is kicked to the curb, when everything in his history shows that he should have been defended. He should have been defended. I want you to notice this as we continue, that he also had a lack of remembering. We've already been kind of talking about this, but look at verse 12. Paul says, "Truly the signs of an apostle were wrought among you in all patience, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds." Paul says, there were signs of me being an apostle of Christ that were made evident, not among other people, that you heard about secondhand, but that you witnessed, that you saw. Paul's saying, you guys don't need just the evidence that you've heard from other people. There's evidence from other people. But he's saying there is evidence that took place before your very eyes, that you witnessed. He says, I did many things among you to prove it. He said, I had patience with you. There were signs, miracles that were being done. There was wonders that were being done, mighty deeds that were being done. Paul says, there were great things that were happening that God was using me to do, that only God's man would be used to do whenever I was with you. They witnessed all of this, and they forgot it all. Those things should have been an evidence to them that he was a true apostle of Christ, yet they ignored it all. They acted as if none of it ever happened. Now, there are times when God's man or other believers have spent years serving God and proving who they are as a man of God or a child of God. And then something happens, someone starts spreading rumors, and everyone forgets the history they have. Everyone forgets who they are, who they've proved themselves to be. And it can even be things that are true. It can be an honest, true sin. But it doesn't give us reason to just ignore everything else that's ever happened. To act as if they've never done anything good in their entire ministry or in their entire lives. The things the false teacher was spreading should have been ignored, and they should have been taking the greater evidence that was before them. We cannot allow ourselves to be deceived when the evidence of the past states otherwise. It should cause us to stop and consider truly stop and to think, this sounds odd. This doesn't sound like the person I know. Doesn't sound like what I've observed. Now, there are times when people deceive. But Christ told us, He said, you'll know people by their fruits. Look at somebody's fruits. Look at their past. Look at what they've done. Allow it to affect how quickly you listen. Take it seriously, but don't take it as truth when there are so many other things that say to the opposite. I want you to notice this too. Paul says that they had a lack of appreciation for him. Verse 13 says, for what is it wherein you were inferior to other churches? Except it be that I myself was not burdensome to you. Forgive me this wrong. Now, something that Paul is referencing here, he's already talked about a little bit in 2 Corinthians. And one of the things is that when Paul was with the Corinthians, they didn't pay him. He didn't want to be a burden to them financially. And so his income was from the support from other churches and his own working. He didn't take anything from them. This was something that he did for their benefit. And from this, it's kind of apparent, and from other things too, and the reason when Paul spends a lot of time with us, we gain from it too, that these false teachers may have been turning that around and making it out to be something that Paul did that was a hindrance to them. It may have been that they were saying that Paul wasn't treating them as a true church because Paul didn't let them support him. That Paul saw them as being inferior in some way, and that's why he didn't let them do it. However they were twisting it around, they were twisting it around to where something that Paul did for their benefit, out of a love for them, out of caring for them, was something that got turned around to being something wrong. I think Paul provides this statement, a bit of irony, but also true desire for their forgiveness if they have been hurt by it. To say, if I've treated you wrongly by this, forgive me. But I think his point here is they were complaining about something that was a blessing, right? I mean, if Paul didn't want to be a burden to them financially, there was a reason, right? He wouldn't just do it for no reason. There was a reason why Paul did it. And it may have been that they were a poorer people. They didn't think they had the finances to be able to do it. And so he let other churches that had stronger ability support him. But this was something that was meant to be a blessing, something that they should have been thankful for. But they allowed the false teachers to take something that was a blessing and to become a point of contention and complaining. Now, there are times when people take something that is a blessing and meant to be a blessing and meant to be something to help, and they twist it around and they complain about it. And it happens. It happens where people, they've done nothing but good things for them, and they take those good things and they complain about it. No, we need to take these things and look at it in an unbiased position and really ask ourselves, is this really something to complain about? Because as people, as humans, we complain about things that really we have no business complaining about. that other people would look at and they'd be jealous of. And we complain about it. Now, there's been times where very good pastors are run off from a church, and it's because that church didn't know what they had when they had them. They didn't value the pastor. They didn't appreciate him and what he did for them and the sacrifices he made. I'm going to be honest with you. Being a pastor is not an easy cakewalk. It requires sacrifice. Emotional sacrifice. Sacrifice of time. In many ways. And I'm not complaining. I'm just being honest with you. There are people that complain about that. Don't realize a good thing when it's right there in front of them. Because there's times that pastors are run off from a church and they go on to another church and the church grows and flourishes and thrives under their leadership. Don't be somebody that gets caught complaining about a blessing, whether it's in the form of a pastor or another believer in your life. Or the person that all they ever do is pour into you. Paul continues here, and he talks a little bit more about himself. He spends a little bit more time kind of talking about how he does things. To try and show them really how absolutely bonkers it is that they have just completely kicked him to the curb. And the first thing Paul talks about is his mindset with them. Look at verse 14. He says, "Behold, the third time I am ready to come to you, and I will not be burdensome to you, for I seek not yours, but you. For the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children." Paul mentions, he says that I'm ready to come to you for the third time. What he's saying is, I've come to you two other times. And Paul has written, this is believed to be the third of maybe possibly 4 letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. We have evidence within Scripture that he for sure wrote 3 letters to the Corinthian church. Only 2 are considered canon. Only 2 we actually have today, but he talks about having written 1 other in 1 Corinthians already. Paul invested in them. Paul cared for them. But he says, when I come to you for the third time, I'm not going to be a burden for you. What Paul's saying is saying, even though you've complained about me being a burden upon you, I'm still going to stay that way because that's what I need to do. Because he says, I'm not coming for my benefit. I'm coming for your benefit to help you. And he provides this analogy here. And that he talks about that children are not ought to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children. He says, the parents are supposed to sacrifice and to take care of the children, right? You don't expect a 12-year-old to take care of their adult parent, right? You expect the parent to take care of the child. Now, Paul's not talking about them in an inferior way. He's talking about them honestly and saying, I'm more mature, I am your leader, and I'm trying to do this for you. It's not right that you should support me when I'm supposed to be supporting you, when I'm supposed to be helping you. I want you to notice the mark of a leader that really loves the people. Here, shown by Paul. They had allowed themselves to reject Paul. Paul had already written 2 other letters to them, had already come to them 2 other times. The Corinthian church, they caused a lot of heartache for Paul. And they're rejecting him flat out right now. And Paul still is telling them, I'm going to come to you. Paul's writing to them right now. They've treated him poorly and have acted as if he's only done horrible things for them. But Paul's still wanting to come. I want you to notice this. This is a mark of a man of God who is one that keeps investing in people that only cause problems for him. Keep investing even though it's a draining thing. Keep going even though they maybe hate his guts. Keep investing. A man that continues when it gets rough and doesn't just leave. The reason they do it is because they love you, not because they have to. Somebody that does this, they serve and they lead others. And they do it from a love for the Lord and for a love of the people. Other children of God, too, that continue investing in people that just drain them. They're not doing it for their benefit. They're doing it because they love the Lord, because they love you. It's the only reason people do it. It's the only reason people stick around whenever things get rough. It's because they care. Someone that keeps going when you or someone else is trying to knock them down should give you cause to consider that maybe they're not the one in the wrong. But maybe it's the other person, or maybe it's you in the wrong. It should give cause for concern, to think. Again, not saying they're perfect, but it should give you cause to think. And I want you to notice Paul's intentions when he comes with them. Verse 15, he says, "And I will very gladly spend and be spent for you, though the more abundantly I love you, the less I be loved." The statement that you read here from Paul should cause your heart to break. Okay, Paul tells them he's coming with the intention, and very gladly, to spend and be spent for them. Paul says, I am very glad to come, to sacrifice myself, and allow you to take from me for your benefit. It's not dread, it's excitement. He's going to give himself and allow all of them to take from him. Whatever it is, whatever he's willing to give it up. And notice this. He says, even though the more abundantly I love you, the less you seem to love me. He says, even though the way you're acting is if you love me less, even though I'm showing my love for you more and more and trying to find as many ways as I possibly can to show it, you're showing it as if you love me less. But I'm going to keep doing it. I'm going to be glad to do it. He's going to continue giving them love and giving them help, even though they seem to be mad at him for it. You need to be very careful. We need to be very careful that we don't ever end up on the side of taking somebody's love and acting as if we hate them for it. Whether it be our leaders, whether it be other believers, it can happen. Where we take their love, and the way that we act with it is if we're just stomping it into the ground and see it as being nothing more than dung. You don't want to be in that part. You don't want to be that person. You need to be the one responding to it with love, responding to it with encouragement, gratefulness. Because even though they're willing to continue giving it to you, eventually they will run out. Eventually there's only so much that can be given. Eventually there's only so much that can be done. And then you will have wasted it all. And Paul talks about that he's coming for their edification, even though he thinks they probably don't even want it. Look at this now, verse 16. It says, "But be it so, I did not burden you. Nevertheless, being crafty, I caught you with guile." Paul, it goes back to them basically accusing him of taking advantage of them by not allowing them to be a burden for him. And he says, "I didn't burden you," but yet apparently they had been saying that he was crafty and basically took advantage of them in another way or later on. He didn't ask for it whenever he's there, but he sent other people to ask for it later on. And Paul calls them out for it. Verse 17, he says, "Did I make gain of you by any of them whom I sent unto you? Any of the others that I sent to you? I desired Titus, and with him I sent a brother. Did Titus make gain of you? Walked we not in the same spirit? Walked we not in the same steps? Again, think ye that we excuse ourselves unto you? We speak before God and Christ, but we do all things, dearly beloved, for your edifying." Paul says, you've accused me of taking advantage of you after the fact. You're sending Titus and this other brother to do it, or somebody else. Where's the evidence to that? Where's the evidence that I've taken advantage of you? That I've treated you poorly? There is none. They acted exactly the same way that I did. You're making it up. But yet we have come to you to edify you, to lift you up. We preached the gospel, and we did it freely, and we took nothing from you. Our greatest desire, he says in 19, was just to edify you, to lift you up, to cause you to gain everything from us. That's what we did. That was our intention. Not just me, but those that I sent. Paul is making it clear here that everything he did and others with him, all they did was for the Corinthians' benefit. And it's amazing here that they were thinking anything else. Because really their only conclusion should have been the opposite of what they were doing, what they were saying, and what they were thinking. If someone's actions only show edification in love, why should you ever accuse them of anything else? If that's the evidence that is before you, receive that evidence as it is. Don't twist it around. Don't ignore it. Receive it. Because they're trying to help you. And you're just kicking them to the curb. You're just kicking them down. And all they want to do is love you and help you. Paul's return trip, he mentions two more things about them. That Paul's not thinking that Paul is fearful that this isn't going to be a fun trip for him. He's still coming. He's coming for their help, but because of what they're going on, he's just being honest with them with what he expects from them. Notice this, verse 20. He says, "For I fear, lest when I come, I shall not find you such as I would, and that I shall be found unto you such as you would not, lest there be debates, envyings, wraths, strifes, backbitings, whisperings, swellings, tumults." Paul says, I'm coming, but I'm worried that when I arrive, I'm going to find immaturity. I'm going to find immaturity. Now, when we look at 1 Corinthians, you see a very immature church. You see a church that Paul just straight up tells them, you guys are a bunch of babies in your maturity. You haven't grown. He talks about that the Lord is causing them to get sick, and even some have died because of some of the things they're doing. That they were doing things that even the Gentiles would go and look at and say, that is horrible. We would never do that. And they were saying, oh, this is great. They had problems. When you read this list, this is kind of the same things that you see throughout 1 Corinthians. Now, when you take a look at 2 Corinthians, there are some things that you see that they corrected. You see some growth that took place in the Corinthian church. The man that was doing something that was having sexual relations with his father's wife, his stepmother, he had repented, and Paul was telling them to accept him back into the church, that they had dealt with the matter. You see other things that Paul talks about that they had dealt with, that they had grown in. So what Paul's saying here is he's saying, I'm worried that because of what's going on here, when I come back, you're going to be the church that you've worked so hard to move past. That I've worked so hard to encourage you to get past. He's saying, I'm worried that you're going to have regressed in your relationship with the Lord. He says, when I arrive, I'm worried that I'm going to show up and I'm going to see a church that's not the kind of church that they should be. Not the kind of church that I've invested in, that I've prayed for, that I've taught, that I've helped, that I've cried over. A church that doesn't love the Lord, that isn't following. I want you to understand this. When we fall into this trap, like the Corinthians, what could happen is we can regress too. We can be somebody that's very immature. Even though maybe we've shown signs and we've had times where we did mature. Or maybe at one point we were mature. And we allow this problem, we allow this thing to come in and to destroy us. Because this is what Paul's ultimate worried about. He's not concerned about himself. Paul's not concerned about that. Paul's concerned about their relationship with the Lord. And Paul knows that if their relationship with him is hindered this much, then that means their relationship with the Lord is nothing. He doesn't want that. Every good, godly believer, for good, godly pastor, leader, the only thing they want is for God's people to mature in the Lord. And when we allow ourselves to fall into these things, the opposite happens. Paul doesn't just fear their immaturity, but he also fears that his time there will be one that is very sorrowful. Verse 21. He says, unless when I come again, my God will humble me among you, and that I shall wait, and that I shall bewail many which have sinned already, have not repented of the uncleanness and fornication and lasciviousness which they have committed. You want to know the number one way that you discourage godly believers that are investing in you and godly pastors that are investing in you? Refusing to repent, to grow in the Lord. You know, it's great when you show up. It's great when you smile. It's great when you say thank you. But what really matters is when you make changes in your relationship with God. That's what really matters to them, because they're there because of their love for the Lord and their love for you. So what they want for you is for you to grow in the Lord. And if you're not growing, it's discouraging. Many a pastor, many a believer has been kept up at night, praying, sorrowful for other believers that aren't following God, or allowing something to continue to just stay, to not make the change. The number one way that you can give a leader, a pastor, what they deserve is by growing in the Lord. All these other problems that Paul's talking about with him, all these other things that are happening, they would all be taken care of if the Corinthians would just desire to grow in the Lord. That's why these things bother Paul, because it's a sign that they're not following God. And that's all he wants for them. That's all he cares about. If you want to be an encouragement, not a discouragement, grow in the Lord. If you're rejecting the Lord as your personal Lord and Savior, you're refusing to accept His gift for you, the only one that you're really, truly hurting is you. Other people are sad for you because you're hurting yourself. Because they want you to be with the Lord, they want you to follow Him. But ultimately, the one that you hurt the most is yourself. If you are a child of God and you're rejecting following the Lord in some way, you're fighting against the ways that the Lord is leading you, or God's people are leading you, ultimately the one that you're hurting the most is you. Ultimately, the one that you're hurting is yourself. So I would encourage you, don't do it for me. Don't do it for someone else. Do it for you. And it will also have a positive impact on everybody else that's around you. You want to see a positive impact on others around you? Make a positive impact in your own life. Grow yourself. We're going to stand. We're going to have a hymn of invitation. Now is your opportunity to respond. Now's your opportunity to take care of whatever the Lord has laid on your heart. However, the Holy Spirit's convicting you, it may be something that I haven't even mentioned. Whatever it is, now is your opportunity to respond. Please respond. Not for me, not for someone else, for you. It's a good thing. I'll rejoice in it. Others will rejoice in it. But it's a choice that you have to make. I can't make you do it. Can't force it. It's a choice you have to make. But please make it.